Captain Marcus Thornfield had served the royal family of Eldoria for 23 years. His back was straight as an arrow, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his eyes never wavered from their duty. At 45 years old, he had earned his position through unwavering dedication and absolute adherence to protocol. The other guards respected him, the servants feared him, and the royal family trusted him completely. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Marcus would take his position outside the young prince's chambers. Prince Alexander was 12 years old, with curious green eyes and sandy brown hair that never seemed to stay properly combed, no matter how many times his tutors tried to fix it. The boy was kind-hearted but often seemed lonely, wandering the vast corridors of the castle with only his books and imagination for company. Marcus had watched the prince grow from a toddling child into a thoughtful young boy, but their relationship had always remained strictly professional. The captain never spoke unless spoken to, never smiled, and certainly never broke protocol. His job was to protect, not to befriend. The royal handbook was clear about maintaining proper distance between guards and the royal family. The castle of Eldoria was a magnificent structure, with towering spires and endless hallways lined with portraits of previous kings and queens. Its walls held centuries of history, but they also held an invisible barrier between those who served and those who were served. Marcus had built his entire identity around respecting that barrier. On this particular autumn morning, the castle was bustling with preparation for the annual harvest festival. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying decorations, flowers, and banners. The kitchen staff worked overtime preparing special meals, and the grounds crew trimmed every hedge and flower bed to perfection. It was one of the most important events of the year where the royal family would meet with common folk from across the kingdom. Prince Alexander had been practicing his speech for weeks. Marcus had heard him rehearsing through the heavy oak doors of his chambers, sometimes stumbling over words, sometimes speaking with confidence that seemed beyond his years. The prince took his duty seriously, even at such a young age. He understood that one day he would be king, and he wanted to be worthy of the crown. As Marcus stood at his post that morning, he noticed something different about the usual castle atmosphere. There was an excitement in the air, but also a tension. The king had been in meetings all week with his advisors, discussing matters of state that seemed to weigh heavily on everyone's minds. The queen had been unusually quiet during her morning walks through the garden, and even the usually cheerful kitchen staff seemed subdued. Prince Alexander emerged from his chambers earlier than usual, already dressed in his formal attire for the festival. His green velvet jacket was adorned with the golden crest of Eldoria, and his small crown sat perfectly on his head. But despite his regal appearance, there was something in his eyes that Marcus had never seen before, a deep sadness that seemed inappropriate for such a young face. "Good morning, Captain Thornfield," the prince said politely, as he did every day. "Good morning, Your Highness," Marcus replied with a formal bow, his voice steady and professional. The prince lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but then continued down the hallway toward the great hall where his tutors were waiting. Marcus followed at the appropriate distance, his boots clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. This was how it had always been, and how it would always be. Throughout the morning, Marcus noticed that Prince Alexander seemed distracted during his lessons. His tutor, Master Cornelius, had to repeat questions several times before getting the prince's attention. During sword practice with Sir Edmund, the prince's movements lacked their usual enthusiasm. Even during his art lesson with Lady Margaret, he stared out the window more than he looked at his canvas. Marcus wondered what could be troubling the young prince, but it was not his place to inquire. Guards observed and protected. They did not involve themselves in the personal lives of the royal family. This rule had been drilled into him since his first day of service, and he had never once considered breaking it. As the afternoon approached, the castle filled with visitors arriving for the harvest festival. Nobles from neighboring kingdoms arrived in elaborate carriages, their fine clothes and jewels sparkling in the sunlight. Local merchants and farmers gathered in the castle courtyard, their families dressed in their finest clothing for this rare opportunity to see the royal family up close. Marcus took his position in the great hall, where the festival ceremony would take place. The massive room was decorated with autumn leaves, golden wheat sheaves, and hundreds of candles that cast a warm glow over everything. The throne sat at the far end of the hall, elevated on a platform that reminded everyone of the distance between royalty and commoners. The king and queen entered first, their crowns gleaming and their royal robes flowing behind them. They took their seats with the dignity and grace that came from years of practice. Then came Prince Alexander, walking slowly down the long aisle between the gathered crowd. Every eye in the room was on him, and Marcus could see the weight of all that attention on the young prince's shoulders. As the ceremony began, Marcus maintained his vigilant watch over the crowd. His trained eyes moved constantly, looking for any sign of danger or disruption. But part of his attention remained on Prince Alexander, who sat straight and attentive throughout the long speeches and presentations, even though Marcus could tell the boy's mind was elsewhere. The festival proceeded according to tradition. Local farmers presented the finest examples of their harvest, merchants displayed their crafts, and children from the village performed traditional dances. The royal family smiled and applauded at all the appropriate moments, maintaining the careful choreography of royal duty. But as the evening wore on, Marcus began to notice something that made him increasingly uncomfortable. In the crowd of common folk, near the back of the great hall, stood a man with his young daughter. The man's clothes were patched and worn, his hands rough from hard labor, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had known real hardship. But it was his daughter who caught Marcus's attention. She was about the same age as Prince Alexander, with dark hair and large, sad eyes. Her dress, though clean, was clearly her only good outfit, carefully mended in several places. She stood close to her father, occasionally looking up at him with obvious love and concern. There was something about the way she watched the proceedings that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of how Prince Alexander had looked that morning. That same deep sadness that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse for the evening feast, Marcus noticed Prince Alexander's gaze had found the same little girl. The prince was staring at her with an intensity that was unusual for him, and Marcus could see the boy's mind working behind those thoughtful green eyes. The evening feast was held in the castle's grand dining hall, with long tables arranged to accommodate both the noble guests and selected representatives of the common people. It was a tradition meant to show the unity between the royal family and their subjects, though Marcus had always noticed how the invisible barriers remained even during these supposedly informal gatherings. As the night grew later and the celebration continued, Marcus remained at his post, ever watchful and professional. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the castle, something he couldn't quite identify. It centered around Prince Alexander, who had grown increasingly quiet as the evening progressed, his young face bearing an expression of deep thought that seemed to age him beyond his 12 years. The first part of this story had established the foundation for something that would soon shake the very walls of tradition that Marcus had spent his entire career upholding. Neither the captain nor the prince could have imagined how profoundly this night would change both of their lives and the rigid protocols that had governed their relationship for so many years. The next morning brought unexpected news that rippled through the castle like stones thrown into still water. Master Cornelius burst into the great hall where the morning briefing was taking place, his usually composed face flushed with urgency. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing quickly to the king, "there has been an accident in the lower village. The miller's family, Thomas Whitmore and his daughter Sarah, they were among our guests last evening. Their cottage caught fire during the night." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he realized these were the same father and daughter who had caught his and Prince Alexander's attention during the festival. He watched as the color drained from the young prince's face. The king leaned forward in concern. "Are they injured? What is their condition?" Thomas Whitmore suffered burns trying to save what he could from the flames. "The village healer says he will recover, but he cannot work for several weeks. The cottage is completely destroyed, Your Majesty. They have lost everything, their home, their belongings, their winter food stores. The daughter, she was unharmed physically. But the villagers say she has not spoken a word since the fire." Prince Alexander stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "Father, we must help them. They are our subjects, and they came to honor us at the festival. Now they have nothing." The king nodded gravely. "Of course, son. We will send gold and supplies. Master Cornelius, please arrange for temporary housing and ensure they receive proper care." But Prince Alexander shook his head. "No, father. Not just gold and supplies. That is not enough." The 12-year-old prince's voice carried a conviction that surprised everyone in the room. "I want to go to them. I want to see how they are, speak with them personally." The queen looked alarmed. "Alexander, that would not be appropriate. The royal family does not make personal visits to commoners' homes. It would create complications." "What complications, mother?" The prince's green eyes flashed with something Marcus had never seen before. Not defiance exactly, but a quiet determination that seemed to come from deep within. "They are people. They are hurting. What complications could matter more than that?" Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement. In all his years of service, he had never heard a member of the royal family speak this way. The protocols were clear. The royal family maintained their distance, showed their compassion through official channels, but never involved themselves directly in the lives of individual subjects. It simply wasn't done. The king studied his son for a long moment. "Alexander, I understand your compassion, but there are traditions, proper procedures that must be followed. We cannot simply abandon centuries of protocol because of one family's misfortune, however tragic." Prince Alexander's jaw set in a line that reminded Marcus startlingly of the king himself. "Then perhaps it is time to question those traditions, father." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the servants who had been quietly going about their duties around the edges of the room had stopped moving. Marcus felt as if he were witnessing something historic, though he couldn't yet understand what. Finally, the king spoke. "Very well. If you feel so strongly about this, you may visit them. But you will follow all security protocols, and Captain Thornfield will accompany you at all times." 2 hours later, Marcus found himself walking through the narrow streets of the lower village, something he had never done in his entire career. His armor felt heavier than usual, and he was acutely aware of how out of place they both looked among the simple wooden houses and dirt roads. Prince Alexander had insisted on walking rather than taking a carriage. "If we arrive in a grand carriage, it will draw crowds and turn this into a spectacle," he had explained. "Sarah has been through enough without having hundreds of curious onlookers staring at her." The burned cottage stood at the end of a small lane, its blackened timbers still releasing wisps of smoke into the gray morning air. The acrid smell filled Marcus's nostrils, and he could only imagine how devastating this loss must be for a family with so little to begin with. They found Thomas Whitmore sitting on a wooden crate outside the ruins of his home, his arms bandaged and his face drawn with pain and exhaustion. His daughter Sarah sat beside him, staring silently at the remains of everything she had ever known. She was wearing a borrowed dress that was too large for her, and her dark hair hung loose around her pale face. When Thomas saw them approaching, he struggled to stand, wincing with the movement. "Your Highness, we did not expect—" He attempted to bow despite his injuries. "Please don't stand," Prince Alexander said quickly, moving forward. "You're hurt. I came because I heard what happened, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do to help." Marcus watched in amazement as the prince knelt down beside Sarah, bringing himself to her eye level. This was completely against protocol. The prince should remain standing, maintain his dignity and distance, but Alexander seemed oblivious to such concerns. "Hello, Sarah," he said softly. "I remember you from the festival last night. You were wearing a blue dress with small flowers on it, and you stood next to your father during the ceremony." The little girl looked up at him with surprise. Of all the hundreds of people at the festival, the prince had noticed her specifically and remembered details about her appearance. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "Your Highness, she hasn't spoken since the fire, the shock of it all. The healer says it may take time." Prince Alexander nodded understandingly. Sometimes, when terrible things happen, words feel too small to hold all the feelings inside us. He sat down on the ground beside her crate, completely heedless of his fine clothes. "May I sit with you for a while?" Marcus felt his heart skip. The prince was sitting on the dirty ground, treating this common child as if she were his equal. Everything about this situation violated every rule he had ever learned about proper royal behavior. "Your Highness," Marcus started to say, stepping forward, but Prince Alexander held up a gentle hand. "It's all right, Captain Thornfield," the prince said quietly, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Sometimes we need to set aside what we're supposed to do and focus on what we need to do." For the next hour, Marcus watched something extraordinary unfold. Prince Alexander sat patiently with Sarah, not trying to force her to speak, but simply being present with her in her grief. He told her quiet stories about the castle, about his own moments of sadness and fear, about the way sunlight looked different through the tall windows of his room at different times of day. Gradually, Sarah began to respond. First with small nods, then with tentative gestures. When the prince asked if she had lost a special toy in the fire, she pointed to a small, charred piece of wood that might once have been a doll. Alexander picked it up gently, examining it as if it were made of the finest materials. "She carried that doll everywhere," Thomas said quietly to Marcus. "It was her mother's when she was a child. My wife died when Sarah was 5, and that doll was all she had left of her." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't just about a fire or lost possessions. This little girl had already endured the loss of her mother, and now she had lost the one physical connection she had to that memory. Prince Alexander carefully brushed the soot from the remains of the doll. "You know," he said to Sarah, "I have something that belonged to my grandmother. It's a music box that plays a lullaby she used to sing to my father. When I miss her, I wind it up and listen, and it makes me feel like she's still with me somehow." Sarah looked at him with growing interest, and Marcus could see her beginning to emerge from the shell of silence she had wrapped around herself. "The thing about special objects," the prince continued, "is that their real magic isn't in what they're made of. It's in the love they represent, and love can't be burned or destroyed. It stays with us always." Then Prince Alexander did something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. He removed the small golden pin from his jacket, a pin bearing the royal crest that had been worn by princes of Eldoria for centuries. It was priceless, irreplaceable, a symbol of his royal heritage. "Sarah," the prince said gently, "I would like to give you this. Not because it will replace what you lost, but because I want you to remember that you are not alone. Whenever you look at it, remember that someone cares about you, and that even when everything seems lost, there are people who want to help you find your way forward." The little girl's eyes widened as she stared at the golden pin gleaming in the prince's palm. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took it, And then, for the first time since the fire, she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but clear as a bell. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, something that had not happened to him in 20 years of service. But what happened next broke through every barrier he had built around his heart. Prince Alexander smiled at Sarah with genuine joy at hearing her voice. And then he did something unprecedented. He reached out and gently hugged her, this common village girl, as if she were his own sister. And Sarah, clutching the royal pin to her chest, hugged him back with the fierce desperation of a child who had lost too much and suddenly found an unexpected source of hope. At that moment, watching his 12-year-old prince show such pure, uncomplicating compassion to a suffering child, Marcus realized that all his years of rigid protocol and professional distance had somehow been missing the point entirely. The true nobility was not in maintaining barriers between people, it was in recognizing the fundamental humanity that connected them all. Without conscious thought, Marcus found himself stepping forward and kneeling down in the dirt beside his prince and the little girl, abandoning his post for the first time in 23 years of service. The gesture felt both terrifying and liberating, as if he were stepping across an invisible line that had defined his entire adult life. Prince Alexander looked up at him with surprise, and then with a smile that held more mature understanding than any 12-year-old should possess. In that moment, Marcus understood that his prince had been teaching him something profound about what it truly meant to serve others. The walk back to the castle was unlike any Marcus had ever experienced. For the first time in 23 years of service, he and Prince Alexander walked side by side rather than in the formal arrangement of guard following at a prescribed distance. The change felt monumental, as if the very air between them had shifted. "Captain Thornfield," the prince said quietly as they made their way up the cobblestone path toward the castle gates. "Thank you for kneeling with us back there. I know it went against everything you were trained to do." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, still processing his own actions. "Your Highness, I spent so many years believing that maintaining distance was the same thing as showing respect. But watching you with Sarah, I realized that sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is simply be human with one another." Prince Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "My tutors have taught me about duty and protocol, about the weight of the crown I will someday wear. But they never taught me that the heaviest crowns are the ones that separate us from the people we're meant to serve." When they reached the castle, word of their visit had already spread throughout the halls. Servants whispered in corners. Other guards looked at Marcus with expressions ranging from confusion to concern, and the king's advisors wore disapproving frowns. Marcus had expected this reaction, but he found that he no longer cared as much about their opinions as he once had. The king summoned both of them to his private study immediately. Marcus stood at attention, prepared for disciplinary action, but Prince Alexander moved to stand beside him rather than taking his usual seat near his father. "I have received reports about your visit to the village," the king said, his voice carefully neutral. "It seems there were some deviations from standard protocol." "Father," Prince Alexander said before Marcus could respond, "if following protocol means we cannot show compassion to suffering people, then perhaps our protocols need to change." The king studied his son with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "And you, Captain Thornfield, do you share this view? After more than 2 decades of exemplary service, you abandon your post to kneel in the dirt with commoners?" Marcus straightened his shoulders, meeting his king's gaze directly. "Your Majesty, I did not abandon my post. I found it. For 23 years I believed my duty was to maintain distance and follow rules. Today I learned that my true duty is to serve the best interests of the crown, and sometimes that means supporting our prince as he shows the kingdom what true leadership looks like." The silence that followed stretched so long that Marcus wondered if he had just ended his career. But then, unexpectedly, the king smiled. "When I was your age, Alexander," the king said, his voice softer now, "my own father taught me that a crown is not a decoration to be displayed, but a burden to be carried with purpose. I have watched you grow and wondered what kind of king you would become. Today, I have my answer." Prince Alexander looked surprised. "I thought you would be angry about breaking protocol." The king shook his head. "Protocol serves the kingdom, son. The kingdom does not serve protocol. When protocol prevents us from being the leaders our people need, then protocol must bend." He turned to Marcus. "Captain Thornfield, your service record has always been exemplary, but today you showed something more valuable than perfect adherence to rules. You showed wisdom. Your position is not only secure, but I am promoting you to Chief of Royal Security." Marcus felt his knees nearly buckle with relief and surprise. "Your Majesty, I thank you." However, the king continued with a slight smile, "This new position comes with new responsibilities. You will be tasked with helping Prince Alexander learn to balance compassion with wisdom, to understand when to follow tradition and when to forge new paths. Can you handle such a responsibility?" Marcus looked at Prince Alexander, who was grinning at him with unconcealed delight. "It would be my honor, Your Majesty." Over the following weeks, the relationship between Marcus and Prince Alexander continued to evolve in ways that surprised everyone in the castle. They still maintained appropriate respect for hierarchy and protocol, but there was now a foundation of mutual understanding and genuine friendship beneath the formal structure. Marcus found himself taking on roles he had never imagined. He became not just a protector, but a mentor, helping the young prince think through complex decisions and understand the perspectives of people from all walks of life. When Alexander struggled with a difficult lesson, Marcus would share stories from his own experiences to help illustrate important points. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander's approach to his royal duties began to change the entire atmosphere of the castle. He insisted on meeting regularly with representatives from different villages and social classes. He established new traditions that brought the royal family closer to their subjects while maintaining dignity and respect for the crown. The most significant change came 6 months later, when Sarah and her father were invited to live in the castle. Thomas Whitmore had proven to be an exceptional craftsman during the reconstruction of their cottage, and the prince had convinced his father to offer Thomas a position as master carpenter for the royal household. Sarah became a frequent companion to Prince Alexander, helping to ground him in the realities of life outside the castle walls, while he shared with her the knowledge and resources that would prepare her for a broader role in the kingdom's future. Marcus watched these developments with deep satisfaction. The rigid barriers that had once defined every aspect of castle life were being replaced by something more flexible and human, while still maintaining the respect and order necessary for effective governance. 1 year after that transformative day in the village, Marcus stood in the Great Hall during another harvest festival. But this celebration was different from any that had come before. Prince Alexander, now 13 and showing increasing signs of the wise king he would someday become, had instituted new traditions that brought nobles and commoners together in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Sarah, now wearing a beautiful dress that had been a gift from the queen but still treasuring the golden royal pin that had first given her hope, stood near the prince as he addressed the gathered crowd. She had found her voice in remarkable ways over the past year, often serving as Prince Alexander's connection to understanding how royal decisions affected ordinary people. "My friends," Prince Alexander said to the assembled crowd, his young voice carrying clearly through the hall, "this festival celebrates not just our harvest, but our community. We are all part of the kingdom of Eldoria, whether we wear crowns or work in fields, whether we live in castles or cottages. Our strength comes not from the barriers between us, but from the connections that bind us together. Marcus felt a profound sense of pride as he watched his prince, his friend, address the people with such wisdom and compassion. The boy who had once seemed lonely and isolated had become a leader who understood that true nobility lay not in separation, but in service. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued late into the evening, Prince Alexander approached Marcus with Sarah beside him. "Captain Thornfield," the prince said with a grin, "Sarah has been telling me about some concerns the village children have about the safety of the bridge over Miller's Creek. I think we should investigate tomorrow. Would you accompany us?" Marcus smiled, remembering how such a request would have horrified him just a year ago. Now it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. "Of course, Your Highness, it would be my pleasure." As he watched Prince Alexander and Sarah laugh together over some shared joke, Marcus reflected on how profoundly that one moment of compassion had changed not just their lives, but the entire direction of the kingdom. Sometimes the most powerful gestures are the quietest ones, and sometimes the greatest act of service is simply recognizing the humanity in everyone around us. The rigid protocols he had once believed were unbreakable had given way to something far stronger. Genuine relationships built on mutual respect, compassion, and shared purpose. Marcus had learned that lowering his post had not diminished his service to the crown, but had elevated it to something more meaningful than he had ever imagined possible. In the years to come, when Prince Alexander became King Alexander, historians would mark his reign as one of unprecedented prosperity and unity. They would attribute this success to his wisdom, his compassion, and his ability to bridge the gaps between different classes of society. But Marcus would always know that it had really begun with a 12-year-old boy's simple decision to sit in the dirt with a grieving child and offer her hope. The most important lesson they had all learned was that true strength comes not from standing above others, but from being willing to kneel beside them when they need us most.